International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Now, interestingly, the moment we start talking about race, we would completely be flustered and confused that, oh, why are we talking about race in India? And we only look at it in a one-dimensional view when we talk about race. Now, I'll come to that in a bit, but let me just explain what racial discrimination means. As per the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, it was adopted and ratified by the General Assembly in 1965. Racial discrimination shall mean any distinction, exclusion, restriction or preference based on race, color, descent, national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, employment or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural or any field of public life. Now, the moment we start talking about such form of discrimination, we would completely say that, oh, it doesn't happen in India, or it happens in India but only in one form. Now that leads me to the second point where I would talk about the features of racism that is prevalent in India. There are two dimensions to that. One is the external dimension of it, and the second is internal, which we hardly talk about. Now when we talk about racial discrimination, we always feel that it's something which is out there and it's not in here. Right? Now what do I mean by that? That is something, and India is a very peculiar case of that, where we have been victims of racial discrimination, but we have also become perpetrators of it now. So that is, it's very interesting that we've ourselves faced that, but we're also doing the same things. Now, interestingly, when you talk about the Indian Constitution, as Kalyani had already mentioned, right to equality is a fundamental right. Now, I'm focusing more on the internal aspect right now. Article 15 of the Indian Constitution mentions, it talks about prohibition of discrimination on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Now, interestingly, our founding fathers of Constitution did put race there, right? And it still exists now. Something that we need to think about. So, as is discrimination on the grounds of caste, on the grounds of sex, and so many other things. Now, this article mentioned that the state shall not discriminate against any citizen on the grounds, as I mentioned. No citizen shall, on the grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them be subject to any disability, liability, restriction, and so on. I mean, it's all there. Now, what I am saying is that this is the internal dimension of it which is mentioned. Now, what is racial discrimination when we look at it internally is when we do or commit such acts to people who are from India, especially and more focused on people from the Northeast. Just hold on, I'll come to that point. Now, the second point is about the external dimension where what I mean is about the discrimination that we do to people who come from, say, broadly the African continent. Now, that is something which is more visible, and that is something which is there more in the media, right? I mean, the death of Masunda Ketanda Olivier, or so many other things that was mentioned. That is something which we see more in the news, right? But we completely sort of overlook the case of harassment of a woman, say, from Northeast, right? I mean, but these are also interestingly parts of the same thing. It's basically looking at it, focusing on the internal or the external dimension. Now, when we look at the other features of racism in India, and that is something which we need to understand, is that it is visible and it is unseen at the same time. Now, what does that mean? I mean, we all know that it is visible, we see explicit manifestations of it when but why I say it is unseen is because we can't really prove that. Now, something like when we say, how does one prove when an auto rickshaw driver asks a girl from Northeast or a boy from Northeast on the streets of Delhi if he's going to Majnu Gatila, right? And we all know, that it's it's a Tibetan refugee colony, but is it not a form of reproduction of, say, common practice of racial profiling, right? So that is something which is there, but how do we then prove that? This remark could also be, if it's a woman, from the region, it would be racial as well as gendered. Now this becomes important. So how do we prove racism when a young co-passenger in a, say, Delhi metro plays Chinese, music on the mobile and telling his friend that he's providing a background music, sneering and laughing in that direction? right? And Chinese within quotes is something we need to understand. So what is important for us to understand is we cannot retell in the language of evidence, and that becomes difficult to prove. So it's most often, racism in India is most often felt and perceived like an invisible wound, difficult to articulate or recall in the language of the law or evidence. In that sense, everyday forms of racism are more experiential rather than an objectively identifiable situation. That's why it becomes important for us to actually talk about concrete laws which would talk of